She pointed at something in the distance. Her fingers were thin and white. You could hang a wet scarf on them, let it dry in the summer air. A bright disk overcomes the figure in the foreground. Ungainly animals head to unknown destinations. Snow is a phone call, a girl left behind, a dog howling. A dog can trespass but not defect, Cora. Even taking you along was not an option. It might have, I don't know. It might have, but you see, it doesn't really matter anymore. But look, my dear, you've managed, you've danced yourself out of the place, like Bereshnikov. Yeah, just about. I'm Anca Cristofovici, a writer and professor of American literature and arts. I live in France. I'm now in the south of France, where there is a small place which I call my studio, where I come and write when I have the time. And I write in 3 languages. My academic work in French and English, my literary work mostly in English, and long time ago, in another life, I used to write in Romanian. For those of us who grew up in a multilingual environment and learning many languages since a very early age, and then being in circumstances where you live in other cultures and who want to live and exist where you are, it's normal. I learned other languages than the 2 in which I function at present. And I always remember this magic of a whole continent that was opening in front of me. Joseph Frost, the author of Radetzky March, born in the Habsburg Empire, where speaking between 5 and 7 languages was normal, spoke other languages but wrote only in German. And he once wrote to a friend when he lived in France that he would have liked to be able to write in French literature. He was writing his letters in French, but to write literature in French, and said that writing in just one language is like having only one hand. So all these Mitteleuropa writers were citizens of the world, even after the world they had belonged to broke up, disappeared, the empire. And Rilke did write poems in French. He also learned Danish, hence the name of Malte from Malte's journal. That was a Danish name. That's maybe less associated to what one knows about Rilke. So yes, that's the world I come from. I go with my lantern and my lantern is going with me. Da oben leuchten die Sterne und unten da leuchten wir. Lanternlicht, verlöss mich nicht, Rabimel, Rabanel, Rabum. English is such a flexible language, and I would say user-friendly. And one adapts easier to English. And I always had this relationship with languages and with several languages and writing in one language, particular language, of the texture and the feel of the language. So I don't know, when one speaks, of course, it's the body language and other details that identify you as a non-native speaker. When one writes, certainly too, but a writer anyway creates her or his own language. And it was very humbling for me when I did the reading tour with Stela in the States to have some wonderful and honestly unexpected remarks about the language. So thank you to my readers. Sometimes there is a very strong sense of freedom. I think writing in different languages offers you a different perspective. As soon as you start learning a language, and I learned other languages than those I write in, but that I don't master very well, and I remember the fantastic feeling of having a huge continent in front of me when I started learning another language. So that's it's a very slow process. Learning a language is very much about understanding the world, understanding people, understanding yourselves, and as long as you appropriate one language, it's no longer foreign, it's yours. Anyway, you're not going to write as a native speaker. I am aware there is a strangeness in my writing in English, but there is a strangeness in all of us. So here we are, January 13th, 2021, and you asked me to tell you a few things about my relationship to languages, but first I'd like to say something about my relationship to writing, because it's about writing in different languages. And here is a sheet of drawing paper, large grain drawing paper, which I have on my wall, and this is a bit of bark, of eucalyptus bark, which I got from Bordighera, not far from the French-Italian frontier. It's a place with a very special climate, and I just love to watch this installation. I have never understood the anxiety of the white page. I think that would be a good exercise in creative writing classes, to have students sit in front of the white page, and if they experience any anxiety, they should better try something else. I think the white page is a great landscape, and it is very inspiring. And here are more rolls of white pages, which I will unroll one day, regardless whether I write or draw something on them. And that's another bark, I think a palm tree bark. And so there are 3 horses in 3 different materials. A few words about different languages. Not exactly what I think about writing in different languages, but how I feel about that. And I prepared a little installation because always when I write, I feel I'm using different materials and different textures and different weights of material and transparencies and so on. I don't know why my mind works this way. So this is hair collected from Angora rabbit, and that one too dyed with natural dyes, and silk, the result of the hard work of many silkworms, and velvet ribbons, they're made of cotton, very hard work to collect and process cotton too, used to, when it was not industrial. Glass made of sand and water and other things that enter into its composition. And this is a very special pencil which artists use sometimes. It is made of a special material, I think graphito, some kind of coal. And I love to write with it because it's very, whenever I write, still write with a pencil, because it's very smooth on paper. And once I found in Lisbon pencils made of eucalyptus tree and of jasmine trunk, and they smelled wonderfully. They preserved the smell, and it was nice not only because of that, but to think of the energy that passed from the trees to the blooms to your hand and hopefully to the paper. This is a rope to bring all these things together, not tied very tightly, with a bead against evil eye. And this is a kaleidoscope, hopefully the result of this mixture of materials. I have lived in 4 countries, well, 3, a little bit in England, but not for so long. Yeah, and I'm perfectly integrated in France. I have friends from everywhere in the world. I have a friend in Japan who is a writer, and when I speak with her, I feel we are part of the same culture. And shamefully, I don't know enough. I wish I knew more about the Japanese culture. My knowledge is very standard, but it is incredible how similar perceptions we have. I don't think nationality or native language has anything to do with writing. The only, there are difficulties. It's not always easy, but why should one be stuck to one's identity? I wouldn't like to be recognized as a writer of that nationality or the other. And actually, on internet, I have several identities because everyone thinks of me as a French writer because I live in France, or a Romanian poet because. So why? No, I am just a writer, and I think this is what matters. Of course, we do have to explore the worlds we come from, and I have done this, but I have done it in both novels in a way which is oblique, as a dear friend of mine said recently, because that's the only way I can address these questions, because I want to address questions, local questions, in a way in which everyone can identify with. And as soon as they are localized in that area of stereotypes, they are stuck there, and it's not what I'm expecting from writing to do. And has to do with resemblance, not with a difference. In his late years, Joseph Roth had a companion, Irmgard Köhn, less known writer than himself, who wrote a novel called Child of All Nations. So that sums it up about how exactly I feel. I have a French passport, but on the cover it's written European nation and European Union, and I feel that's where I belong to. And because I studied and lived and worked in the States for several periods, and in England for a while, but more in the States, I feel also somehow steeped in America. It's also because it's my subject of study. A friend told me recently that she thought of me as a guest American. And so that's what I am, a European and a guest American. As for Mitteleuropa, of course I'm related to it, but somehow twice removed, because all that world has been filtered through my American experience and through living in France. So it's something I haven't thought of for a while because I needed to take distance from that world. And now I realize that actually it's very important for me. And that's why I started writing this novel I just finished, which has to do with an older meaning of what we call today global. Because for each one who vanished somewhere else, another survived, deriving their strength from who knows what, a friend, a relative, the remains of sharing and trust, or perhaps from a tree's sudden blossom, a handful of syllables rehearsed in the dark, that capacity for wonder they'd managed to spare. Do I remember my first line, the first line I wrote? Does anyone remember it? I think if they do, they must lie. Um, I wrote this wonderful poem at age 5. No, I don't remember. However, I do remember how I started, how I learned the alphabet, how to write. And that was on my mother's typewriter, a wonderful Royale. I even now have the sound of the keyboard and the squeak of the box. There was a huge magic box for the typewriter. And my mother used to do translations late at night with a second job. And during the day, that toy was all to myself. And even as it was playful, I was very serious about it. Yeah, so that's how I learned how to write. And ever since, I do make an outline or sometimes a few sketches by hand. But even before computer became commonplace, I needed to see the text as typed. The other association, which is not mechanical but painterly, is that I was also very much attracted to colors and doing frescoes on the walls with lipstick or whatever material came to my hands, very inventive. And so that association between words and images stayed with me and had an impact on my writing.
Do you have to say anything about writing, languages, and the past? No, she doesn't seem to want to cooperate, has more important things to do. And she just speaks cat language. Cats, actually, I know for having had a few of them, they are totally multilingual. They are born like that, and they have it in their eyes.
About choices, why not painting? That was an early choice. That was the choice. The others didn't happen, but that might have been that I drifted towards painting and not writing, but it didn't happen for practical reasons that had to do with going to art school and so on. And I think that was eventually a good thing, since given the path that my life has taken, I would have hardly been able to survive as a painter. So I must thank my mother for having made this choice for me. Not to be a writer, but not to go to art school. And then writing was the option. Photography, I started taking photographs early on, and we used to develop them home in the bathroom. Everybody used to do this because there weren't photography labs, and I was fascinated by that process. But later on, I became interested in photography and how it relates to writing and to the psyche, the developing process. And so I did write a book about photography and aging. And yeah, but I'm a very poor photographer. And I try not to take as many pictures as everybody does today. Video, I would very much like. I was also very interested in experimental video of artists such as Bill Viola or Stan Douglas. And I don't have the technical skills. But the art, which is very closely related to my writing, to my thinking of writing, or to my mental landscape when I write, is actually dancing, modern dance. It probably has to do with the fact that at age 16, it happened as a miracle for where I was, that in the same year, actually 1 month after another, October and November of 1972, Peter Brook showed his famous Midsummer Night's Dream, which I saw 7 times, and Alvin Nicolai's, and both performances were absolutely extraordinary. And I had never thought of dance that way before, and that is something that is very much the body work, the way in which the body forces, fights against itself, adapts, turns around difficult situations, obstacles, falls. I'm very interested in how dancers fall. And yes, I'm still fascinated by whatever developed over the past 60 years. And actually, my novel Stela has a narrator, a choreographer, and Merce Cunningham was very important for me. His method was very important when I was writing the novel. The old custom house stands idle in the midst of rampant weeds. Run down and idle, the custom guard's booth shares its boredom with the hotel in the distance, equally abandoned and despondent. I am too tall and mostly awkward, but I know how to pass, kick, fall, and run. I dance about things that happen. Sometimes I am myself an idle boarder.
And so they drifted, as many had to, at that time and at other times. And I was interested not only in their writings, but in how that drifting and not having a home for the most part of their adult life was transformed in their writing, because none of them writes directly about that experience. Rilke, born in Prague. Nobody thinks of Rilke as a Czech writer, born in Prague, because at the time Prague was part of that bigger world of the empire. And what I was interested in was this process of drifting, which affected so many people, so many anonymous people in so many ways. Roth, for instance, never had a home since the mid-20s, lived in hotels, his life being summed up into about 2 suitcases. Apparently didn't own any of his books, and they were continuously stressed about having papers, because the world they were born in did not have the notion of a passport, and passports were introduced after the end of the First World War. So constantly they had to go to the police, ask for papers, things that unfortunately we are so familiar with now. Reclaim one nationality or another because their homeland did no longer exist. At a certain point, Zweig, who was the most fortunate materially, lived in England and got English nationality. So these are details that might not be of interest to many, but that were interesting for me, because although my characters are fictional, they go through the same process. And there is something of that energy, negative energy of loss and relocation, which was so wonderfully transformed in their writings. That was what I was interested in. And what also mattered to me was that they were all born in a homeland of many nations and of many languages. Some of them wrote in different languages, and even if they didn't, they would have liked to. Joseph Roth writes in a letter at one point, he lived in France in a hotel for many years, intermittently, and that he would have liked to write in French, but he wasn't able and had no time to learn it that well. He had to work hard to make a living, write articles for newspapers, and he says something that, Antonio, you will understand. He says, writing in one language is like having only one hand. And we have to think of these writers as coming from supranational homeland, something that the empire somehow managed, for better or worse, to have function. And there are historians who start exploring that now. You see, there is a lot of talk about globalization and internationalism and this and that, but as soon as a writer doesn't fit into one language, doesn't represent one nation, there is something suspect. Unless there is a certain exoticism. Yeah, exoticism is something of interest, but you have to be inclined to exoticism, and it's not something that I am attracted to. I think exoticism is a way of erasing, of effacing the heart of the matter. Yes, so let's pay homage to these writers whose life ended in dramatic circumstances, and I think it's nice that some of us carry not only their work further, but think of their lives and carry them in their heart as human beings. Yeah, I might sound sentimental, but that's how I feel. They are my family.
Now, from those beautiful gardens, I'm taking you in my studio. It was getting cold, not Canada cold, but cold from the Alps. And I will introduce you to those writers who have been my travel companions for the past few years in relation to my new novel. And they are Rainer Maria Rilke, Robert Musil, Joseph Roth in German, the author of Radetzky March, Stefan Zweig, and also writers from Germany who drifted from their country in the late 20s and 30s, such as Klaus Mann, the son of Thomas Mann, Thomas Mann's brother, Heinrich, and also a less-known writer, but very interesting, Irmgard Köhn. She was Joseph Roth's companion in the mid-30s and is the author, among other novels, of a novel called Child of All Nations. So this is a metaphor which brings them all together, all of them being so different. Apropos of this belonging or not to Mitteleuropa or wherever I belong, an American friend of mine told me something recently which I loved and I'm going to adopt. She said, "You've always been for me a guest American." So basically I think that's what I am, although I don't think every minute of who am I. I have a French passport, but on Oscover it's mentioned European community, and this is what matters to me. So I'm a European and a guest American, and I guess I am a guest almost everywhere. Now, more serious questions. You ask me if language, or how does language identify me or does not identify me. And I must say, Antonio, that I'm grateful for your questions, because these are things that have been on my mind for a long time, but very seldom do I have the opportunity to speak about them. And well, how does language identify me? When you live in France, it is something that you cannot escape. Although, according to some, I am a model of integration, and professionally, I never had a problem in relation to language or accent or whatever, quite the contrary. But in everyday life, as soon as I open my mouth to say oui ou non, bonjour, the obsessional question pops up, vous êtes de quelle origine? And I must say that, after 35 years, it's a bit unnerving. And some people are less sensitive to it. I am trying to be less sensitive, but it turns out that more time passes, the more sensitive I get to it, because I was hoping that someday that will stop. And otherwise, language does not identify me. I'm personal terms, not. I mean, I feel comfortable in all the languages I have better or less better knowledge of. I might be embarrassed because of mistakes I might made, or sometimes mix the languages up. I work in an English department where there are many Anglophones, so we very often pass from French to English, English to French, mostly French when we talk about administration, because we can't find our terms. And so to that extent, it doesn't really identify me. However, it's something that many plurilinguals speak about. It's, there are different attitudes in terms of body language, even in terms of the voice. There are phrases sometimes in one language or the other which are totally untranslatable, or just have such a background that they exist only in that language. So on some level, I would like to be able to speak a language which is above languages. Well, that reality to start with was very complex because of the empire and then because of the drifting. So it's very hard to speak of it in a sense of block. And yes, but there is a certain feeling of this multiplicity, which I do identify with and I do belong to, and probably my attraction to America is in relation to that past. I would say I do belong to that reality twice removed, that is filtered through my American experience and the other experiences I had. I must say that I came to these writers quite late. First, because the writers I feel closer to in terms of formal terms are more experimental. And on the other hand, because the Mitteleuropa writers were too close where I came from, and I wanted to explore new territories. And so now they came along my path because of this new novel, which whose beginning is set in the empire and whose characters then drift in further spaces. I must say that my sense of belonging, probably because of that past that was transmitted to me by my grandparents and by my parents, my sense of belonging is quite all-embracing, and that I've lived in 4 countries by now, let's say 3.5, because in terms of time lengths, and I felt home if I had a minimum of conditions, and sometimes they were quite minimal, often they were quite minimal. I felt home everywhere. I left home quite early. I left homes in many ways, not at all because I was an adventurer, but because I had to. And wherever I wanted to settle for one reason or another, it was not possible. And belonging to me is home is where you are, and it's important to know how to make a home wherever you are. I am lucky also in the sense that I don't experience nostalgia. I think that it is a very interesting literary emotion, but that can be quite self-destructive existentially. And since one of the most drastic departures in my life was when I defected from behind the Iron Curtain, and that at that time, before 89, it was unimaginable that I could ever go back. So once you make this decision, which is not easy to make, then you just go on and make your own path in life. And yes, that's what I can say about that reality. I think I'm combining these two realities, the Mitteleuropa and the American experience, and trying to make my own imaginary reality out of them. And then to the extent to which one's mother tongue becomes slightly strange, slightly different, when one has lived in another culture or in other cultures for many years, once you adopt a foreign language, it's no longer foreign. It's yours, it's part of you, and you make of it whatever all writers do, your own language. Now, the question is not so much that of the writer who uses several languages, because this is natural. It is a question of external perception, and where the extent to which cultures are ready today to accept not only writers who write in several languages, but this plural perspective and this way of relating to life, which is brought not only by living in different cultures, but by using different languages. And that, I think, that's what we can bring to the world, but it's still not very much accepted, maybe not in Canada, but not so much in Europe. Germany, I think, has made more of an opening to writers who were born from parents coming from elsewhere or come from elsewhere. But in spite of a whole discourse on global culture, you still have to be stuck either to a national identity or to an identity of exile or a refugee, and I'm not fitting into categories, but that's what you do when you're not an artist, to my humble opinion. I would like to say a few words about somebody who is dear to me, Tel Adnan, an artist and poet born in Beirut, who left Lebanon when she was quite young, spent some time in Paris, then went to the United States, and then shared her life between California and Paris. Both a painter and a poet, and writing in English and French, and being of Greek mother and Arab father. And I met Ethel several years ago, and I remember she was quite sad about not being accepted because she didn't fit into categories, and she gave me a text to read, which is now a bit transformed. You can find on internet Ethel Adnan, Writing in Foreign Languages, where she speaks about how writing in foreign languages affected her. And it turned out that a few years ago, Ethel, in her late 80s or early 90s, was discovered in the art world, and now she's quite a star in France. And every time there is talk about her on the radio, all the things that she mentioned in that text several years ago that she didn't fit are now extraordinary. It is extraordinary that she's both a poet and an artist, and that she writes both in English and in French, and that she's so multicultural. So that's the problem. The problem is the external perception. And other than being coming along somebody's path who finds that is extraordinary, we'll just go on doing what we know what to do and what we believe we are. and that's it. As for the linguistic choice, that was I like the way you phrased your question. The linguistic choice, the linguistic choice. Um, oh, the linguistic choice has also very much to do with where life brings you. Um, but before life brought me anywhere, and when I was learning languages just to be part of the world as much as possible, English was the last language I learned, but there was something that just corresponded to something really very almost physical. I think my ear is made for the iambic pentameter in spite of my bad accent. Yes, I felt something very organic in relationship to English. And later on, when I started really studying it seriously and reading seriously, that became huge space for me, especially American literature. I remember when I first had a volume of Emily Dickinson's poems in my hand from the American Library. I didn't understand. My English was not good enough. I must have been 17 or something. But again, it has to do with the layout and just the way the words ran on the page and the dashes, and there was a promise of something extraordinary. It's an exploration for me. It's still, I feel like I've read a book on Humboldt recently that you see maybe on the background, and I'm reading a lot about explorers now, something that has to do with a novel that I starting writing, and yes, iambic pentameter. I have a different relationship to British literature, of course, but I remember when I first went to England, and that was when I defected. I was in a very strange state. It just seemed so unreal. And recently I read Elizabeth Bishop in an interview said going to England is like seeing the movie after you read the books. So yeah, in England everything is so literary that it's you don't explore, you are exposed, and you encounter old friends, be they buildings, characters, landscapes. When my mother wasn't home, I would put a cushion on a chair to be at the height of the desk, and started playing before I learned the entire alphabet on the keyboard. I still feel the keys of that wonderful Royal typewriter at the tip of my fingers. I remember them as ivory. I don't think they were ivory, it must have been plastic. But that's how they stayed in my memory. At the same time, I was also learning how to play piano very poorly, and that didn't stay with me. I associated playing the piano with typing on the typewriter. So probably my first lines were some kind of symphonies. Here they were, like at the happy ending of a novel. The train gained speed. Aurora swept the scene with a long glance, absorbed every face, each a letter from an alphabet ready for new combinations. Months from now, years, she will look back at them gathered on the platform of the train station in a faraway land. From wherever she is, she will post her letters abroad, for which they will be waiting as they go on with their lives, each inventing their own Aurora, as each had an America of their own in their minds, on occasion exchanging impressions or memories of her, like stamps that transport you worldwide without a passport. Soot passed through the slit in the window, the receding platform an indistinct line. Across the train corridor, someone's cough resonated. Aurora checked if her papers were still in her purse. She closed the window as she was told. When the train left the fluster of the station behind, Aurora sank into her seat. Fatigue overwhelmed her. She should have stayed home. And where would that be now?